comrades, and welcome back to Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're here for part 2 of our collaborative episode with our podrads from the Regrettable Century, Chris, Kevin, and Jason with Jenny and Abstencia to continue our deep dive into Darko Suvin's Splendor, Misery, and Possibilities, an X-Ray of Socialist Yugoslavia. Those beautiful sweet sounds you heard breaking through our normal intro music this week for the show is actually the national anthem of the SFRY, so we thought it was only fitting that we included that in memoriam of Socialist Yugoslavia as we wrap up our 2-part series this week. In part 2, we're going to talk more about gender equality in the SFRY, worker self-management, the final destructive singularity that brought about the end of the SFRY with its fracturing into the different independent republics, and a whole lot more. And keep your ears tuned because there's going to be a special interlude tucked away into the middle of the episode for you. We're going to dive right in this week, but remember in the meantime, please keep supporting Red Library by heading over to Patreon. Consider throwing us $1 per month, that's a quarter an episode, to get access to all of our free patron-only content, such as episodes, our Discord server, and all sorts of other good stuff we'll probably be doing in the future. If you're listening on iTunes, please remember to give us one of those star reviews, maybe write us a couple of lines, as that helps new listeners find the show each and every day as our reach is growing. Our diabolical scheme to take over the globe with a bunch of leftist podcast listeners is proceeding as planned, but we need you to continue helping us. Also, remember to like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and remember you can always send us an email if you have questions, comments, grievances, condolences, curiosities, all that other good stuff. I'm recording this one a little bit late tonight. I'm just gonna be done. This is it. We're just getting right into the episode. Remember that Red Library is now part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, along with the Regrettable Century and From 78. Remember to go over and check out their shows, find their Patreon pages, support them if you're supporting the work that we do here, because now we're all part of one hive mind consciousness. It's all now pure, big dialectical pessimist energy on the Lost Horizons podcasting network. All right. Let's do this damn thing. Enjoy part 2 of our X-Ray of Socialist Yugoslavia, and we'll see you back here afterward, comrades.
I know that he places the solidification and rule by a separate class in the 1970s. Like he says that, by the 1970s, there is a distinct and separate ruling class that exists. Where does Milovan Djilas place that point? Because I know he's writing about the new ruling class of Yugoslavia, I think probably in the 60s, right?
To be honest, I don't really recall, but I do think it is a bit earlier than what we're talking about here.
I vaguely remember him writing about this because I remember looking it up as I was reading through. I thought it was like the mid to late 50s that he wrote that.
I know he gets kicked out of the party.
Yeah.
He's kicked out of the party and, he's not in favor anymore. So he goes back into private life, which is a little bit different than what happened when you get kicked out of the party in the 50s in the Soviet Union. 1953.
It's definitely published in the 1950s anyways.
So even as early as the 1950s, Djilas is writing and sort of has a nascent critique of the exact thing that Suvin is also critiquing as the primary cause of degradation of Yugoslavia, right?
57.
57, okay.
I think he was arrested for writing it. And that's what happened.
Right. And so I don't want to give more credit than is due to Djilas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think he's he's one of the leading members of the League of Communists. He's one of the leading partisan figures. He's one of the leading figures in the state after the liberation. So it's not like he's not a dunce, and he's not casting aspersions from afar. He's right at the center of things. But I think again, this is an illustration of why it's important to think of social transformation and of history as a series, as a process, as a series of events rather than as an event. Because again, Yugoslav society is one which from the outset, in the construction of socialism or whatever, they recognize class fractions as existing, from peasants to fully employed manual workers to precarious and part-time workers, to a potential bourgeoisie that Suvin identifies as being fairly obvious by the 1970s, but, you know, was, yeah, like implicitly there and potentially there from the get-go. And I think that that's always the case, right? That like the backsliding into the old society, the negation of the negation, that's the possibility that's always there. So that, you know, there are capitalists, right? Bukharin talks about the existence of capitalists in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, but the check on their capacity to be ruling class is Soviet power. GLS's sort of unique theoretical construct is that it's not a capitalist class in the traditional sense, but it's a new class. It's a kind of bureaucratic collectivist theory or a state capitalist theory, which I think is like, it's useful to an extent, but I think that like these things have a way of being presented as like a trump card. They're like, you think you're building socialism, but look, there's a new class, you know, like there are rulers and administrators. And I don't think that we're at a point where we should be so easily dismissed with things like that. I think we should be able to say that like, yes, potentially. But the point is about the clash. And this is, I think even Suvin identifies that if the process of disalienation is continuing, and thus is the kind of like the withering of the state or whatever, and of the blurring of class distinctions, then it's not a thing to, it's an obstacle that can be overcome. It's a hurdle rather than a wall. And I think that that's why a deep study of Yugoslavia, especially through this book, is important. Because I think maybe GLS is right, and also, so what?
Yeah.
A couple of historical points, just since we're tackling this particular aspect. Suvin basically, he is also relying on Branko Horvat here. Actually, that's where he gets his term politocracy from. But in terms of the actual numbers of this, let's say this nascent emerging class, or whatever it is, a class or a stratum, which is even a question in itself. But in 1953, that this particular group is around 220 people. That's what it's estimated as. But by 1961, it's 257,000. And by 1971, so I guess the end of those glorious 20 years, he's basically estimating at it's around 250,000 people. And he basically describes them as the enemies of direct democracy with links to banks and credit institutions, i.e. free-floating capital. So that's essentially the sort of shared economic interest, which is also related to status and security. I thought it was interesting, too. He basically says that the politocracy had material privileges lower than those in Soviet Russia and capitalist states, but it was much larger than most of Yugoslav citizens at the time. So again, like kind of relative within the context of Yugoslavia, it's that sort of relative disparity that he's focusing in on.
Right. I think that's why I like Suvin's identification as that potential ruling class that exists there as a privileged layer in a more like Mandelian, Orthodox Trotskyist way of thinking about the sort of the caste that grows, like cancerous growth on the degenerating corpse or body of the revolution, rather than GLS identifying the existence of a privileged administrative layer as a class. Full stop. Because one is about contending with possibility, right? And one is about accepting the full closure of the horizon. And I think it matters that GLS becomes an anti-communist.
Exactly.
And Suvin does not.
What I was going to say, in any state, there exists a potential for that bureaucratic layer to turn into a privileged class. And I think that he says that what was needed was the continued pushback of the plebeian classes against such a thing to keep it from happening. And that for whatever reason, and he goes into lots of reasons, it didn't. So that there needed to have been, from the bottom up and the top down, a commitment to broadening democracy. And that it didn't exist from the top down and was given up on from the bottom up.
Right. And I think it's probably also important that in this chapter on class relationships, he does discuss the pretty dramatic thinning of the ranks of the peasantry as a proportion of the population. So that by 1974, they have reduced the rural population from 70% of the total society to 30%. And then of that 30% that's the rural population, only 20% are private landowners. So like the actual blurring of class distinctions and the generalization of the proletarian social relation is a very conscious project and a very successful one. So I think that it's useful to know. But I think that if you pair that with the like ballooning of the government administration of police, judiciary, and armed forces, like Suvin is identifying this as like a kind of a new class antagonism. With it, we're not generalizing the proletarian experience to the point of the proletariat abolishing itself. We're just having more people employed as workers. And more people at the helm of the state, which employs them as workers. It's like a successful project, which then begins to be undone by its own contradictions.
Does anybody have the Gini coefficient numbers handy? One of the things he talks about is how the Gini coefficient, which measures income disparity, right? And class divide was lower in Yugoslavia than anywhere in Western Europe. And that he points out that it actually, like Jason just said, that they really did level out the playing field as far as the classes were concerned. Classes still existed, yes, but the disparity between classes was shrunken drastically, and that it was much more egalitarian as promised. It was more egalitarian than the Western capitalist countries were by far, and I think even than the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he actually talks a bit about how classes were much more fluid, and there was actually a surprising amount of upward mobility up until the 60s. He has a couple of, just a proportionality here. He basically says that 2% were living as a capitalist middle class, 10% were close to it, and then 20% sort of at the bottom were living at the existential minimum.
I'm trying to find that in my notes, but I might have just skimmed past it.
I just made that up. Sounded good though, didn't it?
I remember that the inequality levels were average high top pay to lowest pay under centralization was 1 to 3.5, and by the time they had reached decentralization, it was on the order of 1 to 20.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good.
Wow.
Related
That was
to
from the Jacobin article. That figure that I just recited.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah. Kevin, so what happened? You just lost all audio there for a little bit?
Yeah, I've been having on and off problem with my internet. Thought I was connected and everything, and then I tried talking, and then it was very clear that nobody could hear me.
I'll be honest with you. I thought you were going to contradict the party line, so I just muted you until I got through that portion.
We thought you were about to pull a deal us.
That's better than an ice pick.
So just lingering notes on this chapter. He does point to the high degree of social mobility in the 40s through the 60s, as this obliteration of town and country, as industrialization opens up all these possibilities for like meaningful jobs, and the expansion of administrative apparatus opens up positions for like party career, like climbers or whatever. He also talks about the huge leaps forward for gender equality across the board. But again, something that basically stalls out by the 1970s.
Really quick, Jason, do you mind if I share a couple of points on that? Because I had some stats that I thought were really good
do
about
it.
this. So in terms of gender parity in Yugoslavia, so around 1941, so 1/3 of the party were women. 2 million women participated in the partisan cause, and about 100,000 were soldiers. It was the first bisex army in Balkan history. The Anti-Fascist Front of Women, or the AFZ, was called the right hand of the anti-fascist resistance by Tito. That was actually dissolved in 1953, but overall, women granted equal wages, legal abortion, ability to divorce, and general gender parity after 1945. So some very radical shit. Actually reminds me of a lot of Kristen Godsey's work that I know y'all have done some work on too.
I think that is, every time we kind of come around to the ruthless criticism of the experience of actually existing socialism in the 20th century, I think it's really important to acknowledge the otherwise unthinkable leaps forward on the front of like gender equality and of sexual liberation that like I think points to the true believer. It points to the very genuine attempts made by people at the helm of these new states to actually emancipate the population. Now, it doesn't mean that they did it right or that they did enough or whatever, but I think like it's long since time that we put aside this cynical kind of like, oh yeah, they were all just careers party bureaucrats that like use the language of equality and socialism for their own ends. Like obviously you see that emerge at some point, but I don't think that you can do a thing like fight a war and win it and then achieve gender parity within a few years if you're not trying to do something really important and good in the world.
It's one of the failures of all right-wing arguments and criticisms about many historical examples of socialist states is that there's never an explanation of how is it that they did all these things? How is it that they had all this support unless there was actually some legitimate, genuine strivings for an emancipatory horizon that people really do want?
Right.
Unlike in the capitalist states where obviously the mass of people don't really want anything like that. Of course, that never happens.
Yeah.
Right. On the subject of cynically using the language of equality, like look at where we live now.
Oh God, yeah.
It occurs to me that chapter 4 really does cover a lot of what we had like sort of flailed after in the chapter 3 discussion.
Sure.
There's a whole lot about GLS, the new class stuff. I think a lot of it is that, the way that he writes the book is that he presents a series of concepts and then he refers back to them in a somewhat simpler or more clarified form, so that it's almost like if you read the introduction of each chapter, you're really reading the conclusion of the previous chapter. It's a really bizarre way of sorting information.
I actually wanted to ask y'all about that. The structure of the book, and it has this sort of cyclical, repetitive nature of, you keep coming back to the same general ideas and concepts, but every time it's almost like he's adding more and more layers onto them, which I find fascinating, but it also made it just one of the most horribly fucking brutal books I've read in recent memory.
It's because it was a compilation of essays.
Is that right?
That he wove together into a book with a narrative.
Mm.
I mean, he didn't weave it seamlessly, you know. It's a bunch of essays, which is why, like, when you get to the conclusion, you're like, this is like a different essay altogether.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
Not really a conclusion. There's an article that I think that we'll include in our show notes, which is, I think, the skeleton of this book that was written by him before this book came out.
Yeah, I'll include it in the Red Library show notes too, because I thought that was very good.
I thought we were going to include just scans of every page of this book.
I do have a PDF of it that may or may not show up in our show notes.
We might as well. If somebody wants to read the whole book, like, they should.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, they should.
One thing I do sort of not resent, but like I lament that as I'm revisiting my notes, I'm finding that these concepts just get more and more clarified. Even as they're restated in better ways. I don't really lament it, I guess. It's just it makes me wonder if we should have considered that possibility from the very beginning. But it doesn't really matter.
I think in some ways our discussion of it might actually reflect the structure of the book, because I feel like the more we're talking about this, I feel like we're clarifying as the book is clarifying. So I actually think that might come across pretty clear.
All right, I'm convinced. I changed my mind.
And now for a brief intermission.
I just ate a piece of bread
That's tight, dude. Hell yeah.
Holy shit, so did I.
I love bread.
Was it in bulk bread?
No, it's French toast bread.
So mine was...
Kevin, what the fuck is wrong with you?
I went to Fran's Bakery here, which the first one is here in Portland. That's still here, and you can take a tour. I went there, and they gave me a couple of different loaves of bread when you leave the factory. It was like, here's you came to Fran's Bakery.
I just can't believe that's what you've done with it.
What, eat it? What's wrong with eating the bread that I was given? What the hell?
It's meant to be made into French toast.
No, it's
Look,
like
I don't want to go into this.
It's got like all the stuff baked into it. It's not meant to be turned into. It's like
It's
French
already
toast.
French toast.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's consider this a secondary contradiction.
Mine was.
Is it
mine was an
antagonistic
oat
or
bread that,
non-antagonistic?
Brittany and Annalise made
Oh, see, that's awesome.
because it's in bulk, which is pagan St. Bridget's Day,
Well, we're celebrating it appropriately by talking about
Yugoslavia.
administrators' aims having been raised to the political level in 1952. Oh, sorry, 1965.
Well, St. Bridget's Day was yesterday, and today is actually the Feast of Candlemas.
Which is also a good band. It's actually not a very good band.
No, Candlemas rules, dude. What are you talking about?
I'm upholding Jason thought here. It's not a good band.
Just so y'all know, I'm leaving all of this.
I think you should. Like, we'll put some sort of like intermission music on either end of it, you know?
I like it.
Bum, 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 bum. Okay, so look, in chapter 4, Suvin, he restates a lot of his positions from the previous chapters, like we've talked about, with his kind of disagreements with Dielas about the embryonic new class. He talks about Cardale not being capable of thinking the matter through when he says that class struggle continued under socialism, but it was expressed as an ideational political struggle rather than one between, like, in the material realm as a concrete conflict between groups with opposed interests, which is just like basically surrendering to idealism rather than recognize the looming conflict with his peers, like within the bureaucracy. Suvin, I think this is interesting. He actually says that, like, Cardale waffles on the nature of class conflict because he can't bring himself to split the bureaucracy, because it basically gets to a point where, because they've never built any kind of socialist civil society, there is no second tier administrative leadership growing out of the self-administration schemes the way that they were supposed to be.
Yeah, and so Suvin will come back to that at the end too.
The consequences of the stalling out of the deliberate disalienation as a state project means the only thing to do is to kind of forever maintain party unity, which is anti-dialectical, right? Like, we ought to acknowledge that at some point, you know, Stalin acknowledged that maybe he was on the wrong side of it, but he acknowledged at some point the fractions within the state apparatus lay the basis for the next wave of conflict. And Stalin resolves it bloodily, and the Yugoslavs try to postpone it to the point where it becomes much bloodier.
Much bloodier?
What's also
I think so. Just to finish that thought about the bureaucracy and the inability to conceive of splitting the bureaucracy, Suvin says that what this basically leaves is a kind of permanent clash between warm and cold currents of Yugoslav communism, which is really my way of putting, like, that's my note to like summarize basically the whole of the 4th chapter. But the more I've thought about that note, the more I've thought that maybe that's the wrong way to put it, because I don't know if you can ever really have one win out over the other.
I do have that closing out my chapter as well. It does seem like they sort of like shift back and forth and they're being held in tension. I will say this is a bit of a preview for the end of the book, but one of the recommendations that Suvin has of what could have been different was an actual functioning feedback loop system that would translate what was needed, how much resources were available for production from the individual enterprises and workplace councils up to some sort of larger federal state entity that would have then been able to shift and change. So, I mean, I don't necessarily see him as saying like these are mutually exclusive. I think it's the idea of which one dominates, but it does seem like he says that like in the thing that would have eventually worked, or it could have worked, it was the emancipatory horizon. It isn't like one would abolish the other. That was my reading of it.
Right. Yeah. No. He calls the party and the state a Janus-faced institution. It's he conceives of it as this thing that is not essentially one or the other, but is essentially both. And he also conceives of the party as being the possible instrument, or feedback instrument for a real, what he called the plebeian class interests from below. Its emancipatory background, but that its lack of democracy, the lack of democracy within the party, left that potential inchoate and never got realized. So I think he really puts the emphasis on inner party democracy as being absolutely necessary to prevent the ossification of a layer of bureaucracy that can sort of cleave itself off from the rest of society. I think that's an incredibly important, profound point. So one of the things that I find really frustrating by a lot of anarchists is they're like, really a lot of times, not all anarchists, they tend to be very focused on like process and procedure and like inventing the perfect utopian process that we have to like put into practice or whatever. But I think there's a kernel of truth in there that needs to be learned. That is that we need to look to what are the processes that we are building our party out of. What are the processes that define our party that we are building the communist society out of? And those need to be oriented around preventing an ossified bureaucracy from coming into existence.
I also think another aspect that Suvin offers, sort of in addition to that democratic sort of control, how that's woven in terms of just the brutal economic contradiction or problem he also sees, is that a central question in all of this was, what is done with the surplus labor that actually is generated by the workers? And basically, how much control do they have over that? And he does have this interesting thing, again, near the end of the book, but I feel like if we read Run Chapter, we're sort of inherently going to talk about everything in the book. But he basically says that earlier, I think maybe it was in the mid to late 50s, the basic proportion was that for a single enterprise that was, let's say, controlled by the workers, it wasn't, and he says that it isn't as if it was a government of the workers or for the workers, but they did have some meaningful control over workplaces and production. And he says that, like, at some point, 30% of the surplus value that was generated by an enterprise would basically be left over for that enterprise to use. And then 70% would basically be taxed away for the state. And then at some point, they actually shifted that. And this was sort of, I think, in the 60s, in the golden 20 years, where 70% was actually given to the enterprise to do with how they saw fit, and only 30% was actually shifted to the state. And so, eventually that ratio then flips back into the 70s. But to me, this question of a central question, an economic question of post the transition, post the revolution, is what happens to the surplus value is really key here. And I think it complements the question of democracy and democratic control and checks on the party.
Right. Democratization isn't an abstract kind of philosophical notion here, right? I mean, I think he's very systematic in his thinking, and he does talk about the development of communism as a step-by-step democratic disalienation in working and political life. So the question of surplus value and the appropriation of it and the availability of it and the self-management to control over it as a critical question for democratization. That is, if it's absent from our notion of democracy, then our notion of democracy isn't anything more meaningful than the liberal notion of democracy as being having a vote. So I think actually you're touching on something really critical about how we understand this deliberate process of constructing a new world. It's like we we can't separate the economic and political spheres because they don't exist separately in reality.
And that's something that he drives at constantly throughout the book.
Yeah.
Is that the insistence that there is no difference between the political and the economic, and that that was one of the things, the good things about the early days of the Yugoslav state, is that they tied those together and treated them as a single principle.
Yeah, this is from a little bit later, I think it's around chapter 10, but he basically describes it as the way that economic events are interwoven with the epistemological horizons, which is, that's some fancy ass jargon right there. But I think that this goes back to something we've talked about on our episode with Comrade Neil on Ursula Le Guin, and we've talked about it on our episodes together, that in some ways, the horizon that you have in your thinking isn't able to be separated from the political possibilities that you see and the economic possibilities that you see as well. So it's kind of as if the way that sometimes Frederick Jameson will look at, in some ways, like the utopian imagination is the laboratory for what is possible for you to imagine, and this is not an idealized, decoupled thing from real political, economic effects or consequences. And I think that Yugoslavia is a great example of that. The epistemological horizons directly affected the things that were possible in terms of economics and politics. And so, we may not be making the socialist revolution now, but we sure in the fuck can think about it and learn the history and try to understand, like these are going to be very serious common problems to tackle, and to try to understand what could have been different. What was the lost horizon, I think.
Well, right. So on the subject of horizons and lost horizons, to me, the big takeaway points from the next chapter, Chapter 5, are the three horizons that he identifies as possible in the 20th century for the state construction of socialism. And I think it's probably worth noting that, like, in the 4th chapter, he does acknowledge that one of the limitations of, one of the reasons why these horizons, why the one that we desire seems to be the furthest away, is because it's pretty clear that the whole experience of the 20th century is that you can't do this in isolation under a siege mentality. Mm-hmm. The Yugoslavs are doing it even in isolation from the other socialist states. So, like, really, their chances turns out to have been fairly slim, absent some kind of reconfiguring of the broader socialist camp. But absent that, he identifies the three horizons as, like, Soviet-style police state, what we call market socialism, and then a fully associational democracy. And he says basically, like, they reject the first one in 1948 with the break with Stalin, and I think that bears out pretty well. And he says that the second one seems fairly logical as the only other option, if you ignore the third one, the fully associational democracy, which is another way of talking about the withering of the state and the communist horizon and so on. So Chapter 5 seems to be all about the bureaucracy kind of coming to this conclusion that their options are basically just to pick one or two, or waffle between the two. But that number 3 basically disappears as a real possibility, first conceptually and then also in reality. And even though it grows conceptually from that reality of the limitations of isolation and the slowing of economic growth and all the other stuff. But again, I think it's important that he identifies these as, like, deliberate, conscious policy turns rather than just, like, a series of accidents, which is to say that we can't divorce our own responsibility, in what happens in history, because history is just what we do. So he says the world crisis in the 1970s is something that basically the whole socialist camp is incapable of dealing with. And so the options are, again, back between number 1 and number 2 horizons. So you have, like, Romania really triples down on the police state, and China goes the direction of of the market, and every one of these societies is pushed and pulled in one or another direction, and the only direction they don't go is greater degrees of integration, the breaking down of barriers between the various socialist states. You even have the emergence of, like, direct competition between them, and in an environment like that, it's actually remarkable that the Yugoslavs held out at all.
I really came away with that from this whole book, is that under the conditions, the global conditions, and trying to understand those, the fact that they were able to do as much as they did is absolutely revolutionary and astonishing.
It speaks to the value of mobilizing the population by giving them a stake in what happens.
Yeah. I want to touch on this really fast because you brought this up, Jason. So, we've mentioned a little bit, I think in our very first episode, the world historical importance of the oil crises of 1973 and 1979. And, a show that we're a big fan of, Radio Warner, they sort of see that point in 1973 as a really globally cataclysmic event of just how many things shifted from that particular moment in terms of global balance of power. So also around this time too, at this point, they're so kind of tapped into IMF and World Bank loans that as the 70s go on and into the 80s, a collapse of tensions between the USSR and the USA. Basically, once that tension collapses, the financial aid to Yugoslavia from the Western capitalist powers basically gets withdrawn because they don't no longer see them as this necessary counterbalance to the USSR. And there was this interesting line that he has where he basically says the final push that led to the breakup into these nationalist sectarian regions and destructive, horrible civil war was, he said, the final push came from German banks and the Vatican. And I was curious what you all thought about that if you got to that portion of just the role of the Vatican here, because it was one of the things that I remember being shocked by, and I'm like, wait a minute, like, where is that coming from?
The Vatican Bank as an institution is not completely independent, but has a large degree of autonomy from the Vatican itself.
Mm-hmm.
And was used as a funnel for, or as a money laundering scheme for the Gladio operations, which were used to fund right-wing terror organizations in Italy and to destabilize the communists in Poland and in Yugoslavia and in pretty much anywhere else communists were being destabilized at the time. And where a place where the CIA would wash their heroin trade money in order to be able to fund right-wing terrorists during all the incredibly violent years in Italy and all everywhere else. And that's what I know about the Vatican Bank.
Hell yeah. Real conspiracy hours here.
Yeah. I mean, and this stuff is like, yeah, it's all conspiracy theories that turned out to be fucking true.
Very true,
it's
yeah.
like documented now. And a lot of people in the Vatican lost their jobs as a result of it.
Chris, would you say it's all documented, all true?
All documented, all true.
We got the documents, folks. We got them.
So just by way of really getting repetitious here, in this chapter, he talks about the necessity of throttling the law of value. And he talks about like social property as a process itself rather than as a state of things to arrive at. So social property's sort of lowest state of existence is as state property. And then he regards it as a necessity to move into a free association as a higher phase of social property.
He talked about that at the beginning of the book too, as though the reason it was easy to transition to the worker self-management model is because they already had the social property in the hands of the state.
Right, exactly. So there's like, like we said before, it's not like that they had this idea that they were going to do it differently than like the Russians did and that the Polish were doing. It's that they did that and then they thought, well, that's about as far as that goes. But then they kind of stalled out in second gear. They really never figured out how to keep moving, right? And so then he says that basically they go from failure to implement greater degrees of higher stages of social property, under control and protection by the state, by the dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever, brought about a restructuring of capitalism and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I think the only thing I would add to that is that the first thing it brought was the society to a sort of Brezhnevian stagnancy for a whole period. And those are the material conditions under which the creeping and then, leaping forward into capitalist restoration are possible. Because otherwise it doesn't really make sense to see a project go forward and then immediately backward. I think that the period of stagnancy and crises, of growing crises, is probably a necessary part of the picture. But this notion that state socialism begets bureaucracy, begets state capitalism, as like a simple formula that he puts forward, I think on page 89. There's a danger in reading that too simply as basically being an anarchistic argument against the state. But I think it's more an argument that the process of social transformation is a conscious one, and you don't get to just decide that you've arrived at like a comfortable place. And that's basically what happens to all the Eastern Bloc countries. At a certain point, they become entrenched and they become institutional and they become about perpetuation and preservation rather than the necessary advance, or like what Susan Buck-Morss calls like the difference between the war for space and the war against time. And once you're fighting the war for space, to like hold on to what you've got rather than, trying to basically think of the revolution as being necessarily extending, breaking the bonds of space and breaking into into the future or whatever, that the project is doomed, that it's self-conceptually doomed by virtue of the horizon being intentionally put off to the future.
There's a moment, I believe it's in like chapter 7 or 8, where he makes this comparison between whether you're able to still do the sort of Marxian kind of a idea of borrowing your poetry from the future, or whether you continue to look to the past for the revolutionary poetry that's going to guide your epistemological horizon. And that actually reminds me of the Dialectic of Defeat episode that we did, and how I think a lot of our discussion was, where are we getting our revolutionary poetry from? Whatever that is, if that's just a way to think what's possible. Is it from the future? Is it from the past? And maybe that's part of that period of stagnation, is you no longer can access the poetry of the future, whatever that might be. That either meant something really profound or it was a bunch of meaningless garbage.
I'm thinking of poetry from the future, and all I can think of is like Cormac McCarthy and Mad Max and
I think about that one movie that I've only seen as Mystery Science Theater 3000 movie, where all of this film takes place on one spaceship, and they kind of drive around in what look like floor waxers, and they have Captain Santa Claus. I can't remember the name of this movie.
Yeah, dude, I remember that. Oh my god.
I don't know what you're talking about or why it was brought up in any way.
I don't know if y'all know this, but Mystery Science Theater 3000 is my favorite show of all time. Most of my personality is structured around episodes of that show. I'm pretty sure I know this episode very, very well. Is this with the alien that looks like the bird?
No, I think you might be thinking of a different one.
Okay.
Or I might not be remembering.
Every time the main character goes into an action sequence, they make up new names for him. Like,
they call him like Buff
Chief,
Hard Steak.
Hard Chunk.
yeah.
I'm gonna post
hard steak.
I'm gonna post in the supercut of them just reading all the different names they call him. It's a beautiful moment.
It's really great.
Tell me, Dave.
Slab bulkhead.
Fridge, large meats.
Punt, speed chunk.
Butch deadlift. Bold big flank.
Splint, chest hair. Flint, iron stag.
Bolt Vanderhuge.
Thick, McRunfast. We put our faith in blast hard cheese.
Buff drink lots.
Oh, slab. Oh, hunk. Oh, flink.
Let's get out there, kick some ass!
Trunk, slam chest.
Fist rock bone.
Stump, beef knob.
Smash, lamp jaw.
Punch rock groin.
Buck, plank chest.
Stump junkman.
Dirk, hard peck.
Rip, steak face.
Slate slab rock.
Crud, bone meal.
Rip slag cheek.
Punch, side iron.
Gristle, McThorn body.
Kevin, the reason why I brought that up is because what Suvin identifies as the final suicidal singularity is Yugoslavia joining the other socialist states in an unresolvable stasis of political and ideological helplessness and confusion, stalemate, and piecemeal solutions, which is not really the reason I brought it up. It's just I thought that was a good set of words.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, just to try to save some coherence from where we're at.
You might as well.
No, I do think it is interesting that of the three singularities he mentions at the beginning, he sees two of them as being really generative, but this final one, I mean, he describes it as being a suicidal singularity, which I think whenever I started the book, you have this idea that he uses the ideas of singularity as these, again, like really generative things, but it seems like they're, again, they can go either way depending on the period of history and sort of the larger conglomeration of these forces that we've been describing. I mean, I guess I was wanting to ask you all this too, because whenever I think about singularity, I think about something of, I don't know, like infinite density or something where somehow it pulls everything else into it. And that's what I was wondering about, is that why he uses that as the concept, is because there are these moments where everything changes or everything else is like determined by what these singularities are.
Right, like the event horizon of a black hole, or the moment when technology is able to improve itself at a faster rate than humans are able to, or that sort of, like, these are things that we call singularities. I don't know, that might be a part of why he chose the word. That's not what I was thinking of whenever I was reading it.
Were you thinking that he's really just into like Ray Kurzweil and shit?
I was just thinking about robots becoming self-aware.
So I do think that Event Horizon of a Black Hole is a really good example of this third and final singularity anyways. When he's talking about, like, by the 1980s, the capitalists of the world are basically able to bring Yugoslavia down by just like withholding loans. Mm-hmm. And the USSR had basically withdrawn from world politics. And the spinning out and the consequences of the stalled decentralization at the regional level, and that all of the contradictions kind of finally come bursting onto the scene in all of their, basically just that like by the 1980s, it does appear as though Yugoslavia has arrived at that event horizon, that there is no conscious turning back of all of these processes.
Yeah.
That I think he even says in this chapter, or it might have been in the previous chapter, they identifies like 1972 as like the final year in which it would have been possible to have altered the course. I don't recall exactly why, but certainly by the 1980s, he's like, it's all coming undone.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way that whatever contingency or determination could happen, yeah, there was still this space. There was space for something else, but I almost want to invoke the Althusserian idea of overdetermination. You know, by 1971 or 2, whatever Suvin's year is, it's that, well, at this point, things are overdetermined. The sort of trajectories, the different sort of strands that could lead to different things, those now are so thoroughly locked into place that this is the only direction it could have gone. There was no going back, kind of like you were saying.
I don't think that that's unique to Yugoslavia either, right? Like if you look at the differences between the eminent potential of the Prague Spring as opposed to the Solidarność movement in Poland, or of the consequences of perestroika. The difference being that like the first one takes place within the realm of a lot of potential when the socialist movement is on the upswing. Especially 1968, it's a revolutionary year. Imagine linking Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, a reform movement in the USSR, and revolt in the Western world. And then, you know, you fast forward to the 1980s, you have a workers' movement, which is basically fighting for the reassertion of like capitalist and Catholic power. The difference being, you know, again, I think that having tipped over the precipice and basically being in free fall at that point.
Mm-hmm.
There was a McDonald's in Moscow at that point.
Right. Like, I mean, I think, you know, our responsibility to history is always to try, but the circumstances were like seem to have been infinitely better at a period in which revolution seems to be on the table, or at least in discussion worldwide, like in the 1960s, as opposed to the 1980s.
When counter-revolution is the only thing on the table worldwide, globally.
Right, exactly. Where you go from the revolt in France to Mitterrand, a socialist president in France, ushering in the neoliberal turn.
Yeah. I still
in
think,
the 1980s.
In terms of just making sense of the 20th century, I think that this whole period from mid 60s to 1968 is still one I just feel that hasn't ever fully been grappled with by most of the people on the left that I've ever encountered.
It's funny, the study group that I'm in that met this afternoon, our discussion ended at, aren't we basically still trying to finish living out the post-68 experience? At what point are we capable of moving beyond it? That's a question of participation, right? And of self-actualization, as opposed to passive recipients of like learned wisdom, because the post-68 moment is rotting on the vine. Like it's well past time to be put away.
Yeah. Know? So I guess finally helping us exit from the post-68 moment and solving the national question, those are the two things that we're going to do together.
Yeah,
we're going to knock both those out.
That's why we're starting a network, because it's too much of a task for like 2 podcasts, 3 podcasts separately. They have to be together.
We're also remixing the warm and cold streams.
That's right.
Yeah?
And Marxism. Yeah, we're going to remarry them.
So that we can just become lukewarm and get spit out of God's mouth.
Yes.
That is going to be our tagline for the network.
So look, there are other thoughts from the many other chapters of this book.
Yeah.
But they're really, to me, they're like incidental and
sort of reiterations.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them are reiterations. There are some distinct points, but they don't really stand on their own. They only stand to like further explain the primary concepts that we've kind of gone over. I just think like an interesting notion that he throws out is that it's like into the 7th chapter, and he just kind of asserts that like the party just wasn't like ideologically prepared for peacetime construction. You know, maybe as a sort of a kind of an epilogue, that seems to be the case for every party that took power around the world. That the taking of power, it's a worthy obsession, right? But it doesn't appear that at the level of political theory that anywhere was anybody even remotely prepared to shift gears. And you know, that's how you can have these clashes between socialist states and these like permanent sense of embattlement. And so maybe that's the great task of this century is again to seize power, right? But to seize power with the explicit goal of reorienting to what we call peacetime construction, such as it is possible.
Yeah, and I think in the last chapter he invokes this sort of Gramscian idea to describe this, is to say the shift has to be from command siege mentality structure to the party as an educational organ, something that is, very much ingrained in the people. And the other way he describes that I found really helpful was he basically says from coercion to consent. Like that's another way to conceptualize what has to be the task. Because I think it's a good point. And it's something that Mandel once said, that revolution isn't an end in itself. Really, that's just the starting point. And I think that all of these situations show that once that happened, once you seized power, the complex things were only getting started. There's a line that Rusanow had in his book that I found really interesting, where he says, one of the criticisms that even, Stalin had and the Soviet Party had, which he says there was some merit to this, was that because of the uniqueness of the Yugoslav situation and the partisan struggle in seizing power, you have, I think at that time, most of the members of the party were under 30 years old. A huge majority of them were from peasant backgrounds. And he said they accomplished this unbelievable feat, winning multiple struggles against the Nazis and against the royalists and all this other stuff. And they were so pushed by the momentum and the belief that they could do this, that no matter what the legal, administrative, economic task, that they could be successful. They really operated on that, and they did amazing revolutionary things, and they were not prepared for the real complexity of the problems in the global political economic situation they were going to have to contend with. And to me, I thought that was very sobering, just to say, they did something amazing. And in some ways, maybe they were very confident that they could do anything because of it, and unfortunately, they could not. But no one could. Like you said,
right.
No party was able to successfully solve the problem of this era of after you seize power, how do you transition?
We mentioned this in the episode that we did, the most recent episode that we did with Varn about socialism in one country, that the ultimate thing that the Yugoslav experiment came up against was the limitations of its borders. And that was what the Soviet Union came up against. That's what China came up against. And I think we mentioned this earlier, is that Yugoslavia had it much worse than the other socialist states did, because they were not only isolated from, the West, but from the Soviet bloc as well. So even if the Yugoslav communists had an orientation that allowed for them to deepen democracy and to do the things that Suvin said would have been necessary to carry that feedback loop to allow the worker self-management and decentralization to create a system that allowed for like a true symbiotic relationship between state and workers' councils, they would still have come up against the limitations of trying to create socialism in the Balkans.
And
a
peripheral economy that had only barely been industrialized.
And on top of that, you've always got those IMF loans. They're going to come due.
Like at that point, you have to be prepared to not pay them back regardless of the cost, right?
And I think one of the things about those IMF loans is that the nature of structural adjustment programs, and Yugoslavia absolutely suffered from this, was to even get these loans. Part of what's going to happen is whenever push comes to shove, you're going to have to sell off everything in your economy, your social services, all the sort of internal structures that make for a thriving society, whatever the hell that is. And it seems that Yugoslavia absolutely had to deal with that as well. It's like that is the nature of those loans. They are a mechanism of control, and they are a mechanism of dominance and power and disciplining economies that step out of line. And I think, unfortunately, my reading of the situation and the sources that we read show that, they were disciplined and brutalized the same way that so many other nations that existed on the periphery were.
He goes into this in the later chapters, that the structural adjustments that the IMF is pushing through were sort of boiling a frog, as they say. They started out as not actually challenging the nature of the economy. Like, they didn't want to try to, at first, get them to defund their social programs or privatize things that had been nationalized. They just got them to decentralize power, allow the state banks to localize, allow power to be more confederalized instead of federalized, and all along knowing very well that this was going to lead to the growth of these national centers of power around the banks.
It was really shifting power from the state to international finance.
Yeah.
Right, with the banks as providing the fulcrum.
And the administrators of trade with international enterprises, right? They were positioned to be the ones who were directing the flow of capital internally as it meets the external economic world. Right, so they were positioned to aggrandize themselves through that process, or enrich themselves through that process.
I don't know if we're there yet, but I have a kind of quote that I would want to read that's really from the end of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia chapter, but I think it really serves as a really good wrap up for the entire book.
I mean, I feel like we're there, and it's
Yeah,
about that
absolutely.
time.
I feel like as far as energy levels are concerned, we're definitely there.
So, he's talking about the general trajectory of stalling out and stagnating and of crises and of degeneration and falling apart, that we've been talking about for the last half hour. So just the last paragraph of the last chapter in part 2, he's talking about the ways in which he conceives of as overcoming that stagnation and degeneration and crises and collapse that we've been talking about for the last half hour, of returning to the internal ideological key being the relationship of disalienation to the project of expanding the task of building socialism. And then he says, but the precondition for all of that was a radical political and ethical change of the mindset inherited from Stalinism. That's what he's saying is something that needed to happen. Yet the professional party core had totally forgotten Marx and Lenin's eager lifelong pursuit and acquisition of new knowledge. Indeed, they fell prey from the 1960s on to the worst intellectual sin possible. They didn't want to know, to face the radically new problems of the times. A revolutionary politician must be an intellectual on pain of pursuing death.
All right, that's
Yeah.
I think that's a good closing line. Yeah.
That's where, yeah. I mean, it probably could have been read a little bit more eloquently, but if somebody
Definitely
somebody wants to reread that, that's fine with me.
I'm gonna put in some very dramatic music behind you while you read that. I'm gonna put in Smash Mouth behind you while you read it. All right, that does it for our two-parter on Darko Suvin's Splendor, Misery, and Possibilities, an X-Ray of Socialist Yugoslavia, with our podrads, our Lost Horizon comrades in arms, the Regrettable Century. Thanks, y'all. I'm assuming you're listening to this. Podrads from the Regrettable Century, thank you for inspiring us here at Red Library, for collaborating with us, for having the courage, the resolve, the sheer reckless abandon to tackle this book with us, as it was quite a beast. It was a literal three-headed Cerberus guardian of hell level beast. I almost wanted to say it was like a Final Fantasy boss fight. That's a deep cut. How many of you out there like to game, like to play those old RPGs? I used to back in the day. Yeah, I told y'all, it's late. I'm really incoherent right now, so we're just done. We're just wrapping up this episode. All right, big shout out to all of our patrons, all of our listeners, all of our supporters. Hey, we'll even give a little bit of a shout out to the haters, whoever those are. We really hope you enjoyed this two-parter on the SFRY, its history, the lost future of socialist Yugoslavia. And I'd like to just end this week just with a short pondering on the radical attempts made towards socialist transition, towards a communist horizon, that even though it failed tragically, they made real strides. And because I'm actually a big fan of caring about things, unlike some other postmodern neo-Marxists that I know, I honor them. I honor all the comrades, all their work, all their sacrifice in trying to bring about the communist future and the SFRY. And it might be a very small thing, but we won't forget them. And we hope you don't either, and that's why we wanted to bring you this episode. So until next time, comrades, keep dreaming, keep fighting, keep listening, keep talking with each other, keep looking for the others. Stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay invigorated, and hopefully, one of these days, we'll all find a way to be emancipated together. Until next time, we out here. Red Library out.